the role of alcohol was more as a kind of palliative for dealing with what we would now call PTSD. The casualties were pretty grim in these battles. And a lot of these guys who'd fought off German and Italian attacks on these mountaintops, they were very traumatized.
Hello and welcome to this week's pod. My name is Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor and your host. Now today I welcome Mark Urban onto the podcast. He's a familiar name here in the UK as one of Newsnight's presenters, but he's also the author of some fantastic history books. From his 18th and 19th century titles of rifles and generals, he's also written on tanks during the war. I've read a number of his books covering more contemporary events as well, including Big Boys Rules, which looks at the role of the SAS in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, Task Force Black, about the SAS in Iraq, and the Skripal Files, which is fascinating, all about the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter in 2018 by the GRU, probably on Putin's orders. He's chatting to me about his latest, Red Devils, which is about the parachute regiment in the Second World War. Now, reading his book, it really does look into many of the features of warfare that probably don't get as much of an airing as they should. And so what you heard at the top there was an important thing to address: booze whilst fighting. I don't know if you've ever read Journey's End by R.C. Sheriff or seen it performed. There was a recent film made in 2017, but booze features heavily, and that was set in the trenches of the Great War. Alcohol and war have gone together since antiquity. Who can forget Alexander the Great's big drinking bouts? We also talk about the genesis of the Paras, their commander, Boy Browning, and the debacle that was Operation Market Garden, aka A Bridge Too Far. Coming up, I'm going to have a few bonus podcasts for you. In light of last week's chat with Simon Sebag Montefiore on family world history, I'm going to do a top 10 of historical families. If you've got any suggestions, let me know either on the Twitter or email me, history@aspectsofhistory.com. All links are in the show notes. In December, I'm going to dedicate a bonus episode to top historical movies. Now, I know you might be thinking, or some of you might be thinking, well, we've already heard yours. But I'm going head-to-head with an industry professional, writer and director Tim Hewitt. Whilst I bring some historical knowledge, he's coming at us with technical expertise. If you can subscribe, please do. In the meantime, I'll hand you over to me talking with Mark Urban. Mark Urban, welcome to the Aspects of History podcast.
Hi, Oliver. Good of you to have me.
Well, Mark, I'm very excited to talk to you because I have read a number of your books over the years, and it's always a great pleasure to read yours. And I've just finished your latest, Red Devils. And then, but just before we kick off, I have to tell you, Mark, you are not the first Newsnight presenter to have been on this podcast. Jeremy Paxman has been on.
Hallowed footsteps.
Yes, big shoes to fill. He was talking about his book on coal. Have you read that?
Sorry to say I haven't. I'm sure it's good.
It is. It is.
But in the general logjam of the last few months, I haven't been able to read it. I saw he had it out. It's great that he's got another book out.
And I was interested in that because how do you juggle? I mean, this is an authorized history of the parachute regiment in World War II. But how do you juggle what is a full-on job at Newsnight, presenting and I know you've mentioned you're about to travel to Taiwan. How do you juggle that with writing books? Because you're quite prolific as well.
Well, it's certainly not easy. I mean, you're right; it is a full-on job. I think what I do is, because my day is back to front, and I'm working in the evening when most people are at home, opening a bottle of wine and reading and playing with the kids or whatever. It does mean that I tend to have the mornings free, which is useful for research time. But there does come a moment when I need to write a book and get the first draft down, and at that moment I take unpaid leave from the BBC. And normally I factor in about 2 months for that, depending on how long I think the book is going to be, to just sit down methodically just get it down in first draft form. And then, once you've done that, the sort of editing process and revisiting and redrafting can be done on the weekends and mornings and other times. So it is a labor of love, certainly, to work in this way. I sometimes say it's a bit like me driving a cab, in terms of being a second job and adding to the general stresses and strains of modern life.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting about this book is it is authorized. A number of your books in the past, I think you've had to struggle with getting through the MOD and other organizations like this. Did you work closely with the Parachute Regiment or their archives for this book?
You're right that in the past, when I've been writing about current events and sensitive matters relating, for example, to special operations in Iraq, clearly when you're writing about special forces and intelligence based operations and things like that, it is a much more sensitive area. It is true, though, that this book is, it's different in the sense that obviously it's historical. So in that sense, it's less sensitive from the point of view of the MOD or the Parachute Regiment or whatever. And it's also true to say that whereas in the past, pretty much every book I've done was an initiative that I took. This was an initiative from Penguin, who said they wanted the book. And I think at a pretty early stage, got involved with the Air Assault Museum at Duxford. And that they're civilians there, but they work closely with the Parachute Regiment and other elements of airborne forces and catalogue their story. And so from the get-go, the curator of the museum, John Baker, and the other staff were really quite involved, actually, in guiding me to the best archive that they had and that kind of thing. And then just across the way there at Duxford, you've got the IWM's archives. And, obviously I made a lot of use of those as well. So there were rather a lot of trips to Duxford while I was researching this. And that's where, an awful lot of the really prized, the journals or the, it was the case, I think, with many people who went through World War II that people would write these sort of memoirs, often typescript, sometimes longhand, for their families in the 50s and 60s, some even in the 70s, a sort of what did you do in the war, Dad type of account that was really just intended for circulation among family and friends. And I found when I was writing the Tank Wars book about the 5th Royal Tank Regiment in World War II, that they were really interesting and valuable accounts. And lo and behold, I found a few of those in the Imperial War Museum's archives at Duxford. And they're really good at bringing alive, the sort of interior life of the Parachute Regiment in its early days and early campaigns. And like those earlier books, I've tried to sort of home in on specific unit or battalion and certain characters within it. So, the unifying theme through the book is the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment. And in the early pioneering days, before they left Britain, we find the main characters all sort of training together. In one case, 3 of the 6 main featured players are all on the same training jump in the same plane with only 10 people in it. So that was quite handy narratively to find them all in the same place. And that's what I've done. So to circle back to your question, it really was a partnership, particularly with the Airborne Assault Museum from the get-go. And therefore, yes, at a certain point, pretty late on, the Parachute Regiment itself took a look at it. But by that point, the Air Assault Museum had already had its, crawled on over it and inspected it and looked at the manuscript, to make sure there weren't mistakes. Now, I bet there probably are still 1 or 2 mistakes in there, and for which in normal authorly fashion, I take full responsibility. But they did. And in fact, a few people from that community, historians of the Parachute Regiment, looked over it to make sure that there weren't any ghastly
I'm sure not. I'm sure not.
Well, you always do. Oliver, I always say that when you write a sort of heavily factual book, as I tend to do, and let's say you've got 20 or 25 facts per page, if you have a 99% rate of being correct and right in what you've written, you're still going to have a mistake every 4 or 5 pages. Now, in the hands of a hostile reviewer, that is, this book contains dozens of errors, which may be true. I clearly hope it isn't in my case. But if you then turn it around the other way and say, yes, but it's 99% right, that's the difficulty, I think. And in this area of history, there are, of course, a lot of very, very enthusiastic amateur historians and enthusiasts who, all the way from the people who meticulously comb the records in the Hartenstein Museum in Arnhem, and a lot of Dutch people actually very, very passionately invested in the history of that campaign, for example, through to the kind of living history people, the war gamers. There is a big community of people who will be poring over every detail in this. And of course, in some cases where they say, no, you got this wrong. In fact, of course, they're wrong because they haven't investigated it to the degree that you have. And in some cases, it's fuzzier. There's more than one truth. And there are different versions of events or whatever.
I'm trying to restrain from asking you what your biggest error is in previous books, but I won't ask that. That's a very horrible question. But it's interesting the parachute regiment to me, because with the SAS, they're very careful about their reputation in history books. Are the parachute regiment less so, or less sensitive? Because I suppose they don't go on so secret as operations as the SAS do. But is there a sort of nervousness about their reputation?
Well, I think I'm sure the parachute regiment is keen to protect its reputation in a day-to-day sense. Like when some dreadful thing happens on an exercise and people are drunk and whatever. I'm sure they're sensitive to that. I think the key point here, though, is, and I think this is the interesting one for a podcast like yours, the point at which these episodes pass from living history into deeper history. Now, the Airborne Museum at Duxford were very, very quick to tell me when we started, because obviously the focus was on the 2nd Battalion, particularly in the context of Arnhem. Were very quick to tell me we are not aware of any surviving member of the 2nd Battalion who dropped at Arnhem, which obviously is a bit of an eye-opener. But there it is. There are some Arnhem survivors, clearly, who are still alive. But from the 2nd Battalion at Arnhem, they said, we don't think there are any left. Now, so, one can quibble about, well, yeah, there's a handful from the 9th or the 12th Battalions in Normandy or whatever. Yeah. I mean, yes, of course, there are still some survivors left of the wartime parachute regiment, but there's very few, sadly. And even those that do survive to today, they are passing on very quickly. So this history, I think, is now moving into a slightly different category. And they said from the outset, actually, tell it like it is. We're quite prepared for you to do, to discuss subjects like people's nerve going, running away or surrendering or stuff like that in circumstances where they might have fought on. All of those quite sensitive topics, which, for example, if you look at some of the books produced soon after the war, like The Red Berets, which is a very good book, but it treads carefully over some of those subjects because so many of the people involved in those operations were still alive. And I think we've passed on from that now. And I think from the point of view of Penguin and the museum, they'd read the Tank War book, which did deal pretty frankly with things like circumstances like guys bailing out of tanks through fear, that they were about to be knocked out by tigers or whatever, or indeed shooting people who were shooting Germans who were attempting to surrender. and how that happened a few times and what the circumstances were and whether it was or wasn't a kind of dubious act. So those subjects were dealt with pretty frankly in the tank war book. So I think they knew that I would deal pretty straight on. So there is, for example, an exploration in the book of whether or not General Gale, who was the commander of the 6th Airborne Division, which landed very successfully on D-Day and did a fantastic job, but whether he had given an order that they shouldn't take prisoners. And that's dealt with in the book. It's pretty clear that in his pep talks to some of the units, he did say that. He did say on that first night or whatever, don't mess about, don't take prisoners. In other words, that getting to their objectives superseded all other interests. Now, obviously, you're looking back on that 80 years on, that seems like a pretty dubious order to give people. But I also discussed through looking at some of the cases where prisoners either were killed or were not, the fact that clearly many soldiers didn't take that order literally, and hundreds of prisoners were taken, German prisoners, in the first 24 hours. So, that kind of thing is quite a complex subject. But I think it is true to say that as it passes from living history into deeper history, one can have a more frank discussion about it.
Well, the genesis of the whole airborne, I guess I'm trying to. You as a military man know the terminology; it comes naturally to you. But is it the airborne sort of brigade or division probably is more accurate. It quite late on in the war, and you mentioned in the book the Germans had done this in the 30s, the Americans, I think, as well, even the Italians. Why were we so late? And greatest respect to Italians who listen, by the way.
Yeah, well, they were. I mean, one thing you can say about the Italian forces in the 30s, I mean, they were very innovative in certain respects. People write about their naval frogmen, and they were innovators in military parachuting as well. The only three countries that had taken it really seriously in the interwar years were the Soviet Union, Germany, and Italy. And they all had significant airborne forces in being at the start of the war. And of course, the Germans in Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Greece, used airborne landings very successfully as part of their blitzkrieg formula particularly for so-called coup de main operations, stroke of the hand, or however you want to translate it. But the idea being that you would drop ahead of advancing troops and seize a key bridge or neutralize a key strong point in the case of Belgium. And that would make the wider advance go more quickly and more smoothly. So, yeah, they were all invested in it in the 1930s in a substantial way. The British had not done that. And really the genesis of the creation of the Parachute Regiment and Airborne Forces more widely was in June of 1940, when Churchill issued an order saying we need a corps of parachutists, and he suggested it be about 5,000 soldiers. Now, one of the interesting things that happened then is what didn't happen, which was then basically an enormous amount of time wasting by the RAF that didn't really want to give the army the aeroplanes to bring to fruition Churchill's vision. The army did start to form units, and critically, just over a year after Churchill's order, they put this army-wide appeal out for volunteers, and they got a couple of thousand of quite characters, a lot of them quite extraordinary, coming forward. So you had a mobilized army in the millions, but you had them looking for sort of the 2,000 in a way who were keenest to get into action or to volunteer for something special and dangerous and different. So a pretty extraordinary band of people came forward.
And
I mean,
you were paid
everything
more.
From,
you were paid more, weren't you?
Yep.
Very important.
2 bob a day, as they used to say. Parachute pay. So you got more money, you got the prospect of action, and you got something exciting and with an air of sort of being elite about it. So they did get guys, and they were they were actually, if you look at the people that came forward, they were very similar to the profile of people who in the post-war period, the post-war army, we would say, would typically have gone forward for SAS selection. So they were older, they weren't 19-year-old conscripts by and large. They were guys in their 20s, some of them even in their 30s. And a lot of them had been in action before. And when the first parachute battalion was formed in 1941, one of the officers in it said 70% of them had been in action before, which is pretty remarkable. They were either professional soldiers who'd been serving on the northwest frontier of India, but some of them had done things like being in international brigades in Spain, the French Foreign Legion. I mean, they were a real bunch of hoary adventurers who came forward in that first wave. And they were used to form the first 4 battalions of paratroopers, about 550 men in each battalion. And eventually in the late on in 1942, after all this wrangling about missions and aircraft and all the rest of it, they were sent to North Africa to be part of the effort there to do this sort of coup de main concept, to go ahead, seize a key pass in the mountains or a key airfield and ease the passage forward of the Allied armies that had landed in Algeria and were coming into the rear, if you like, of Rommel's Africa Corps at the time and the Italian forces in North Africa. So that was their first big mission. But that was the genesis of it. It was Churchill in 1940. And to be frank, when Churchill issued that order, it was only a few weeks apart from the order he issued setting up the Special Operations Executive with the famous word, set Europe ablaze. And I think really what Churchill had in mind when he issued that first order in 1940 was the idea that following Dunkirk, we had to do something for the sake of morale, for the sake of keeping the Germans on their toes. And therefore, what we should be doing is sponsoring and assisting saboteurs from the French resistance or the Dutch resistance, whatever, raids by parachutists, such as the one that was eventually carried out at the beginning of 1942 by the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, and doing this at a sort of quite a small scale. So, a few saboteurs or 120 soldiers who were landed in Normandy in 1942 to raid the Bruneval Railways radar station. I beg your pardon. So that was the concept initially, and that's why the fact that so many of these people who came forward were the sort of what we would now think of as the special forces type of soldier, wayward individuals who'd been in combat, who despised garrison life and square bashing and Blanco and all the rest of it, and just wanted to get stuck in. And yet that was all seemed to sort of match up. But of course, what then happened was when they sent them to Tunisia, it became clear that no, these guys weren't going to go on daring missions overnight for a few hours and then be picked up as they were in Bruneval. They were going to have to fight in the mountains of Tunisia for months in the most terrible circumstances, basically to outperform the regular infantry of the British Army, which, in some of those battles inevitably got into difficulty. And the paratroopers had to be there to essentially be better soldiers than them and to be a better kind of line of battle infantry, not guys with daggers clenched in their teeth, shinning up cliffs and carrying out raids at a small level. And that's really the story of the sort of organizational transformation that takes place during the war that I describe in the book, about how that happened and what the key moments were and how the individuals responded to that.
And you mentioned that the characters who volunteer, who are, I guess they are, and they're mentioned throughout the book as being, they're told they're the elite, and so they obviously feel like they're the elite. But their first command, the most famous commander probably is Boy Browning, who is this sort of Grenadier Guards officer who does like drilling and neat uniforms. And so he doesn't really, he's not a hugely popular commander, is he?
No. I think before I go further, the Webb Carters are a Guards family, aren't they?
Indeed.
I remember David.
But
Was David in the Irish Guards?
my father is the Irish Guards, so you can slag off the Grenadier Guards. That's my uncle Evelyn.
Well, I thought I might be treading here on hallowed ground. Yeah, well, in a way, I mean, Browning is a sort of fantastically problematic historical figure. Obviously, a lot of people know about him as portrayed by Dirk Bogarde in the film A Bridge Too Far, and understand about his role in Arnhem, and you know, should he have gone? Should he have attempted to lead in the field? Did he deliberately set aside intelligence that cast those sorts?
I'm very keen to talk about this, actually. Yeah.
Those sorts of historical controversies. But just as interesting to me was Browning's role in setting up this new regiment, because let's face it, you know army families, and we've just been joking about the difference between the Irish Guards and the Grenadiers and all that sort of stuff in the Coldstreams. And they are tribal organizations in many ways. And if you're going to establish a new regiment, eventually, as it was called, the Parachute Regiment, you're going to have to create the tribal symbols, the badges, the shoulder flash, the para wings, all these other things that become the key factors in defining how people look, the things they've got to go through, Pegasus Company as it's now called, but the initial training that was carried out at Hardwick Hall during the war to basically select the fittest guys and get them ready for parachute training. All that stuff, is enormously important in defining what is a new regiment, what is its ethos, what are its values. And Browning was undoubtedly critically important in that. He was also fantastically good at getting things out of other bits of the army. He was a supreme networker. He had fantastic social connections. He was married to the novelist Daphne du Maurier. He'd been at Eton. He knew ministers. He knew loads of generals. And he could get all sorts of things. So those 2,000 guys who used to form the first 4 battalions. Equipment, buying jeeps when he saw them demonstrated, because he realized that jeeps could be fitted into gliders and provide mobility on the ground. Organizing, what shape should a parachute battalion be compared to different, all these things. Browning was tremendously important. But there was an aspect in which I think his mindset and grounding in the army, in the traditions of the Guards, was a problem in bringing together all these wild soldiers and, mixing them then in with citizen soldiers, the national service soldiers who had been conscripted but then volunteered for parachute duties. And there were lots of clashes, I think, in values, because Browning's thought was, well, okay, you've all got to have the same, airborne flash or whatever. That will help you feel a sense of unity. You'll all have done the same 7 jumps and had that sense of achievement that you conquered your fear. All good. But he thought, well, what do we do in the army? How do we bind people together? Well, one of the ways we do it is we can do it by region. So you can say, okay, well, A company of the 2nd Battalion is going to come from London, B company from the north, C company from Scotland. That's what they tried doing, using people's regional affiliations. But he was also all for a tremendous amount of, drill, square bashing, marching people up and down. Well, you've got light infantrymen who march much faster. You've got other regiments with other traditions. No, we've got to make them all the same. We've got to drill them up and down so they can all march together and all be the same in that respect and unify in that way. Well, obviously, for a lot of these guys who were just thirsting for action and had volunteered for special missions, a load of parade ground drill was the last thing they wanted. So there was a lot of fractiousness. And I think while one can sort of, in many ways, discount that in the National Service Army, the wartime army, as, the perpetually browned off sort of Tommy Atkins, puffing away on his ciggy outside the cookhouse and always having something to complain about, I think they had real reason to complain, these guys. There's one of the central characters in the book who writes, and he wrote this in 1943, we were training to fight the Germans. We were not training for a drill competition. This was their resentment. They just thought, why are we wasting time doing this kind of stuff? A tremendous emphasis on what Browning called turnout as well, not just, highly polished boots and creases in your battle dress, but clean fingernails. He would get soldiers to take their boots off when inspecting them on the parade ground to make sure that their socks didn't have holes in. The haircuts, all of these details were things that he drilled down on, and which basically drove to distraction a lot of the soldiers who had been assembled for this new special force. And you can say, well, all right, okay, garrisons and, sometimes people have martinet tendencies or they get carried away. Once it gets to the field, the realities take over. But even in North Africa, the soldiers found that they were being forced by their commanders to salute. Now, there's an order that comes out which says, basically, we've got slack about saluting. So soldiers will salute in and out of the line. Now, if I was a platoon commander crawling up to my frontline positions in Tunisia with German paratroopers, a few hundred yards away, I'm not sure I'd want my soldiers to salute me. It might just point out who is the guy for the sniper to pick off. But lo and behold, the order came down, as did orders about not wearing anything other than steel helmets during daytime, not wearing their berets at night, it's standing in trenches for days at a time, waterlogged. The soldiers felt outraged about this. And in the final analysis, the one that really got people going was an order that when the soldiers were killed, and generally they used the soldiers' blankets that they'd been issued with to carry the corpses down to collection point or burial point. And an order came down, you must recover those blankets and put them back into stores. And I think on that one, a lot of the troops in the line just ignored it. They just felt so outraged that someone was not even going to have the dignity of being dropped into their resting place, wrapped in a blanket. So there were these kinds of petty orders which characterized the early days of the regiment. And I think certainly with regards to the preoccupation with drill and turnout were very much part of Browning's mindset. And when he left the scene, you can see things changing in all sorts of ways and a lesser interest in that. Although, they always tried to say that they tried to be the best in all things, including, smartness and being when they were on parade and all the rest of it. But, more of an attention to the direct military business of getting guys fit and confronting the enemy.
And there seemed to be a certain informality as well that came out in the book. I mean, in particular, I'm thinking of an example where I think it's Sergeant Forsyth had his commander up, sort of cornered him and told him, "You're drinking. You shouldn't be drinking."
Forsyth is a fascinating character because he is a regular army man. In many ways, he was the sort of guy who Browning expected to instill discipline in the newcomers. He'd been a soldier for 10 years by the point you mentioned. So, he'd served in the 1930s. He'd been in the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders and then volunteered for special duties. He had parachute duties and was on one of the first courses to be trained in airborne warfare. But Forsyth was the son of a militant miner who had been sacked from a variety of collieries for trying to organise trade union activities in those mines. So Forsyth had a real sense of class antagonism, and he basically had a problem with officers. And he couldn't curb his temper. And in the moment you mentioned, he decided, having been through these awful battles in Tunisia where he felt it was him and the other NCOs that had held the line and certain officers who'd let them down, he felt he had the right to confront one of the officers about his drinking as he saw it. Now, I mean, it's an interesting point. I don't know whether that speaks to less formality or greater informality in the regiment, or whether it simply spoke to the fact that a lot of those early volunteers were very strong characters and couldn't just be relied upon to button their lip and go along with the hierarchy. I mean, I would say, if anything, that the parachute regiment, in common with the rest of the infantry in the Second World War, from all the accounts I've read, remained more formal or more likely to obey the standard disciplinary rules than, for example, tank crews, where having got right into that in the previous book, there was that business of literally sitting in a tight metal box and sharing the destiny of not being able to get out if you were under fire for 24 hours at a time, having to pee in a shell case, literally having all the smells and everything else of your fellow crewmen. That the junior officers who were in the tanks and the troopers or corporals or whoever who were in there with them, I think they had a great degree of informality. But I think in the parachute regiment, because of the nature of closing to combat, sometimes with the bayonet, but certainly up close and personal with the enemy, I think there was a greater formalism actually than the tank crews and some of the other elements of the army. But still, I digress. I think the reason Sergeant Forsyth lost his rag with that guy was because of the type of man he was, really.
And the boozing was interesting to me, because booze must have been quite a key part for many soldiers, because they're carrying out horrific acts of bravery, jumping out of a plane. It would seem to me to be quite a common thing for all ranks to be drinking. No, I don't want to imply though that they're all raving alcoholics, but booze must have been quite commonplace amongst serving men during the war.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think what happened, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, even before, for example, we take the 2nd Parachute Battalion, even before they went to North Africa, they had a terrible reputation among publicans, one of whom christened them yellow bastards, because they had yellow lanyards at that time, the 2nd Battalion. And they were banned from various pubs because of the kind of wild drinking and the fights that were breaking out. I think that was in a sense to do with the fact that they were all yearning for action, and they were like caged war dogs, or whatever metaphor you want to use. But I think once they got to Tunisia and they really got stuck into the ghastly reality of this, holding these trenches atop mountain ridges in North Africa in bitterly cold winter there, the role of alcohol was more as a kind of palliative for dealing with what we would now call PTSD. The casualties were pretty grim in these battles. And a lot of these guys who'd fought off German and Italian attacks on these mountaintops, they were very traumatized. And so I think when one reads the accounts of them, being given a run into Algiers or somewhere else and really getting blasted, and the military police having to scoop them up, and the fights and all the rest of it, I think that element of trauma and mourning the lost comrades and doubting their own chances for survival all contributed to that kind of bacchanalia, when they were given the chance to run off the leash into local North African towns. And Johnny Frost, who was the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, and is another one of the central characters in the book, he was just sort of bemused by this. He couldn't understand, why the soldiers were so wild when they were let off the leash in these North African bars, and he struggled to try and work out how he should deal with it, what he should do, because obviously he was concerned about the reputation of his battalion and the scraps with other units and the constant issues with the military police. And he really struggled with that. And I'm not sure he ever completely understood it. He later commented, later on in the war, eventually we got the right sort of non-commissioned officers, the sergeants and corporals who knew how to manage this. But I wonder, really a big part of it was that by the time they went to Arnhem, for example, the 2nd Battalion, it was at least 70% soldiers who hadn't been in North Africa. So many had been lost, either as prisoners or wounded and killed in North Africa and Sicily, that a lot of those wild early veterans had gone, and he had what were more like the typical national service soldiers by that point of the war, who were more accepting of authority and just wanted to do the right thing and not get returned to their original unit or thrown out or court-martialed. They just wanted to keep their nose cleaned. Now, Frost himself, of course, is an interesting example when one talks about drink. I mean, it's very clear from listening to the interviews with the other officers that served with him in North Africa, for example, in the Imperial War Museum Sound Archive. And one of them says, if there was any officer who drank more than Alistair Pearson, who commanded the 1st Battalion, it was Johnny Frost. And Johnny Frost was well aware of the fact that he used whiskey a lot to, if you like, self-medicate amid the stresses of that campaign. And he even, when he wrote his autobiography, he called it A Drop Too Many, which clearly was a pun on the bridge too far, but also an allusion to his fondness for the Scotch.
A Bridge Too Far, you've mentioned that. It's an iconic film. The book is very good, based on the Cornelius Ryan book. And reading your book after Normandy, which is a great success for the Paras, I got the sense that with a number of operations being planned in the area around Arnhem and Holland, that the senior officers, the senior commanders, have this airborne brigade, and they want to use it, or airborne division rather, and so it seems as though they've got this sort of hammer, and everything looks like a nail, and therefore Operation Market Garden will do that because we've got all these airborne troops. This seems like it'll work. And I've read your book, the Cornelius Ryan book, and I think the Beaver book. It is extraordinary to me that it even went ahead, the whole operation.
Yeah, well, I think your interpretation or reading of it is very fair. I mean, look, they'd had 16 or 17 planned. Well, Operation Market, I think, was the 17th plan that was drawn up after D-Day for possibly using the 1st Airborne Division, which had come back from North Africa, but it hadn't done the D-Day landings. That job was done by a different one, the 6th Airborne Division, different British one. So they were all yearning to get into action. And from fairly soon after the D-Day landings, they were thinking, oh, well, maybe we could drop behind the Germans in Normandy and stop them getting away, or maybe we could drop in the west of France, or maybe we could drop on the Belgian border to once again stop them getting away or take advantage. So all these plans came up one after another. And at various points, some of them even got to the point where, the paratroopers would be driven out by truck to the airfields, and the Dakotas would line up and everybody would be waiting for the order to go, but it didn't happen. And so, yes, I definitely think there was an element of that. There was a feeling, look, we've got these highly trained British and American airborne divisions, and they could make a big strategic difference if we get this right. But time and again, that sort of sweet spot between the time it would take to actually prepare an effective and worthwhile operation and events not changing on the ground so quickly that would then be rendered useless, that planning, they got on the wrong side of that equation time after time. Events just moved on too quickly for them to, stop the Germans retreating out of Normandy or the various other ideas they had. So eventually, when the idea of dropping to take the 3 bridges occurred at Operation Market in September, early September, it was spun up. There were guys who were just so fed up. I mean, there was one staff officer who, in his Imperial War Museum interview, he says, I had spent 3 years being buggered about, and I was damned if I wasn't going to go on this operation. And then, fantastically, he said, if they'd asked us to drop in Berlin and wait for the arrival of the Red Army, we would have done it, which is just extraordinary. Of course, that is post-war hyperbole. But I think it speaks to their determination to just get into action. And I think there was a slightly odd duality about this and a sort of gallows humor as well, because a lot of them realized that these plans were pretty dubious. At the briefing for Operation Comet, which was a sort of previous version of the Operation Market plan, to seize those bridges, but to do it just with a British airborne division, one of the officers turned to the other who'd been given this job of rushing onto a bridge and taking it and said, "A Victoria Cross or a wooden cross, old boy," sort of thing. And another guy, a subaltern in the 2nd Parachute Battalion, wrote in his diary after their briefing for Operation Comet, "It all seemed like a rather elaborate way of committing suicide." So they knew it was dangerous, and yet at the same time, many of them absolutely yearned for it. They knew there was a big element. There'd been this shorthand used in the 2nd Battalion mess for a good year before Operation Market, the bloodbath. Oh, we've got to get to the bloodbath, and they would use it in a sort of gallows humor sort of way as being something that, yes, would be terrible and intensely risky for them personally, but they didn't intend to miss. So there it is. There's the attitude, that sort of duality of it. I mean, I found a letter, I think it was written in the early 1950s, so relatively soon after the war, from Brigadier Lathbury, the commander of the 1st Parachute Brigade, whose job it was to go and seize the Arnhem bridges, in which he said the plan only ever could have worked against minimal opposition. And that our assumption was there would only be minimal opposition. It could only have ever worked against minimal opposition. And I mean, he's obviously right. And clearly by that point had the benefit of hindsight. But it was that kind of belief that, if you were sufficiently daring, the enemy's sufficiently disorganized, it just might work. That seems to have been the underpinning of that ill-fated operation. I mean, clearly it's a thing. It's, I think, the one aspect of the Parachute Regiment story that, if anything, has been told and retold too many times since the war, because there's such enormous sort of interest in it. And I find that in itself fascinating because, you look at the operations in Normandy, which, yes, they have received a certain amount of historical attention, the seizing of these key bridges and denial of others to the Germans on the flank of the British landing, fantastically successful. Yes, there have been books about the 9th Battalion seizing the Merville Battery and the 7th Battalion seizing those 2 bridges over the Orne and the canal, but not nearly as much. And then, at the end of the war, Operation Varsity, which effectively does what Market Garden was meant to do. It gets the Allied army there in northern Germany across the Rhine. Very successful as well, but very little written about it after the war. And so there you are. That is Market Garden. It's the thing that continues to exert this fascination on so many people, including, of course, the Dutch who live in those areas where it happened and who still enthusiastically, you get the school children putting the flowers on the fallen soldiers' graves every year, the commemorations, the civic aspects of it. It's extraordinary, the depth of interest and attachment still to that campaign.
There's a beautiful picture in the book of it's very sad, it's very moving, is a picture of a cross with a paratrooper's helmet on it, being sort of looked at by a soldier who's liberated Arnhem in April. Is it April 45?
Well, I think you might be. There's 2 pictures. There is one, as you say, of a cross with, I think it says, I'll just have a look, in Dutch, unknown British soldier in Arnhem, as you say, after liberation. But there's another one in a graveyard in Normandy where the soldier is crouching down.
Yes.
Unknown English soldier, it says, on the parrot with a terrible, helmet with a bullet hole through it, on the cross in Arnhem. Yeah, absolutely. And the other photo, which I think is in there to underline the sort of awful human cost, is one in a churchyard in Normandy, where a couple of guys from the 7th Battalion, which is the other unit whose story we follow quite a bit in the book, because their battles were all different to those of the 2nd Battalion. And he's visiting the graves of a couple of his mates in that churchyard. Terrible loss rates. The 7th Battalion on D-Day had 68 soldiers killed. What a tremendous loss in one day. And of course, another double that figure wounded. Enormous losses from a unit of only 550 people. So yeah.
Mark, I could talk to you probably about this for a lot longer, but we're running out of time. So I suppose my final question really is, what are you working on next?
It's a good question, but it's not really one I can answer. Not because I'm doing something incredibly sensitive and secret that would get me clapped in irons if I revealed it to you. But I haven't yet settled on a subject for the next one, and
what are you thinking?
It's interesting. There are lots of things There are lots of things I could do. I think it's fair to say. I mean, I would like to go back into, deeper into history. I love the early, late 18th, early 19th century period, Napoleonic and Revolutionary period.
Oh, I wanted to pick you up on something. You didn't put Sir John Moore in your book of generals.
Ah, yes. Well, that's a whole. Bill Slim, of course, is one that I get.
That's true.
Criticised for as well, but. Yeah, well, maybe we should do second tier generals. I love that period. I mean, it is true that in terms of the publishing and the marketing of books, the Second World War is particularly still a very big and hot subject. So it may be that I come back to another Second World War topic, or indeed something closer to the present day. I mean, listen, I've done all three types of book in the past: World War II, deeper history, and current affairs, stroke, sensitive stuff, whatever we're going to call it, special operations. It could be any one of those things, I would imagine.
Well, Mark, thank you very much for your time. It's been great talking.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Oliver.
Coming up, I've got Saul David on the US Marines in the Pacific. Roger Morehouse is the Aspects of History Book of the Month with Devil's Alliance, the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939. And Peter Hughes chats free speech and writing history in these febrile times of social media and pylons. All three are good friends of the show, so it's great to have them back on. Remember, if you've got any ideas for top 10 families from history, you can get me on the Twitter or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. In the meantime, thank you and good night.